Hello and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Before we start, I want to mention that our building is open all 7 days a week. On the weekdays, it's from 10 to 4:30. Oops, let me just turn that off. So I hope that this program and other programs that we hold will inspire you to come and visit our building in person and come and see the exhibition and the objects that I talk about in my Curator's Corner. So anyway, please come and visit. We even have guided tours available if you reserve them in advance. One other thing to say before we get going, as I always say, which is to just encourage you to use the Q&A window of Zoom. If you've got any questions or comments that you'd like to raise, I'll make sure to get to them at the end of my presentation. Okay, so today I want to talk about this photograph, a photograph of the luxurious Royale Hotel in Evian-les-Bains in France that stands in our second gallery. The hotel hosted the Evian Conference in July of 1938, which turned out to be one of the turning points of that year that in hindsight we see as an event that gave Hitler the green light to move forward with his plans to persecute and eventually to commit genocide. Here is one of the text panels that we have with this photograph. It's rather long, so I put it on its own slide. It says, many Jews wanted to leave Germany, but few could find a country willing to offer asylum. In July of 1938, President Roosevelt called for a conference in Evian-les-Bains, France, and invited 31 other countries to address the issue of political refugees. After 9 days of meetings, nearly every participating nation, including the United States, refused to help European Jews. Only the Dominican Republic agreed to accept a small number of Jewish refugees. The inaction of world leaders sent a clear message to Hitler: Jews not wanted. That sums up a great deal. I want to talk a little more about those details and the details that are touched on in that paragraph about how the conference was held at this hotel from July 6th to the 15th in 1938, 83 years ago this week. And I thought I would start with the actual hotel that is in the photo. The Royale Hotel was built in 1909 by the Evian Mineral Water Company. And by the time of its construction in 1909, Evian had been a famous destination, particularly for the wealthy, for more than 100 years. You can see here that Evian is on the eastern edge of France, on the Swiss border. The town of Evian is actually located right on Lake Geneva. And although the hotel where the conference was held is located above the town and looks down onto it, and you get a view here of a contemporary view of the hotel, I think you get a sense that this hotel is right above the town. It's right in Evian-les-Bains, but above it, giving everybody this grand view. Here's another view from the early 1900s that shows the hotel and the funicular railroad that enabled visitors to quickly go up the steep hill and get to this point on the top where you look out over Lake Geneva. The therapeutic qualities of the water in Evian were discovered by Count Jean-Charles de Laizet in 1790. So this hotel was built in 1909, but the first person to really find out that the waters in Evian were special took place back in 1790 when the Count was fleeing some of the mob rule in Paris during the French Revolution and came to this edge of France and stayed for several months at a friend's house, a guy named Gabriel Cachat. And Cachat had a spring on his land that Laizet drank from almost every day while he was there for 3 months. And Laizet noticed, apparently, that over time, the pain that he had always suffered from kidney stones began to disappear. The water, he came to believe, was his cure. And in 1807, Cachat, the guy who owned the spring, had the water analyzed and was told that it could cure kidney and bladder diseases. In 1823, so about 30 years after the Count had first come across this water, an entrepreneur from Geneva, just down the lake, by the name of Fauconnet purchased the spring from Cachat, along with another spring in Evian, and established the Evian Mineral Water Company, formerly known as the Société des Eaux Minérales d'Evian. But it was a company that was going to sell this water and make this water available for commercial purposes. Fauconnet, the guy who bought these springs, eventually went bankrupt, but a hotel had already been built in the town of Evian, and that hotel purchased the springs and then further developed the area, getting the town renamed from Evian to Evian-les-Bains, Evian the Baths, in 1865. That's when the town was renamed. In 1878, the new owners of the water company got the French Ministry of Health to actually authorize the bottling of Cachat water, the water from this spring, on the recommendation of the Academy of Medicine. So there was this medicalization approval for this special water. And by 30 years later, the year before the hotel goes up in 1908, the town was already a well-established spa with several hotels, and Evian water began to be bottled and sold across France. After World War I, the city maintained its status as a high-class spa town, hosting socialites and royalty, people like the Aga Khan, the Maharaja of Kapurthala, King George V of England, and King Fahd of Egypt. Really a kind of who's who of wealthy people around the world would come to Evian-les-Bains. So in 1938, when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought a gathering of world leaders, Evian-les-Bains seemed like an appealing place to meet, where the various national representatives would be able to enjoy some luxury while also discussing a pressing problem. The pressing problem, of course, was what to do with all the Jews who were trying to get out of Nazi Germany. You'll recall that Hitler came to power in January of 1933 after the Nazi Party won the largest share of the seats in the German Reichstag, the German parliament. Hitler had been blaming the Jews for Germany's problems since his initial foray into politics in the wake of World War I back in 1919. In September of 1919, Hitler issued his first, what's now thought of as his first written comments about the Jewish question, as he termed it. And he said that Germany should create discriminatory legislation against Jews, and that the ultimate goal, he said, must definitely be the removal of the Jews altogether. That was back in 1919. In parliamentary elections through the 1920s and early 1930s, Hitler and the Nazi Party message continued to blame Jews and call for their removal from Germany. And not surprisingly, once in power, Hitler and the Nazi Party began to implement the discriminatory legislation that he had written for and called for back in 1919. The first major action came against Jews on April 1st, 1933, when the Nazis called for a national boycott against all Jewish businesses in Germany. Nazi stormtroopers, like the ones you can see here, put up signs on Jewish stores and then stood outside to keep customers out. The one-day action actually turned out to be largely unsuccessful as customers continued to go into the shops. But what followed over the next several years was a gradual ratcheting up of pressure on Jews and a gradual erosion of popular support for Jewish friends and family, friends and neighbors, in the face of a massive propaganda campaign that repeated on radio, on billboards, in every newspaper, the message that Jews were a menace to Germany. Signs in almost all public venues sought to separate Jews from non-Jews and to emphasize that they should leave. The first wave of anti-Jewish legislation was the period from 1933 into 1934, and it focused largely on limiting participation of Jews in German public life. The first major law to curtail the rights of Jewish citizens was the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, passed on April 7th, 1933, so just a week after that first boycott. And it banned Jews from serving as civil servants. So Jews could no longer work in the government bureaucracy of any kind. They couldn't serve as judges, most of whom were civil servants, or teach at most universities which were owned by the state. Other laws followed that limited the number of Jewish students at schools and universities, prevented Jews from serving as doctors or lawyers or newspaper editors or a range of other professions, blocked Jews from owning land, banned Jews from the national health system, prevented them from serving in the military, just wave after wave of new law. The passage of Aryanization laws, which forced Jewish business owners to sell their companies to non-Jewish Germans, was another effort to exclude Jews from the economic life of Germany. Between 1933 and 1938, the number of Jewish-owned businesses fell by 2/3. This is a store or a photograph of a store that stood in Frankfurt. And you can see there are two names actually on the store sign. Stam and Basserman was the original name, is the new name, and then it says formerly Gummy Weil. So the old name is now being replaced as a new owner comes in. Advertisements announcing similar changes also blossomed all over German newspapers. This one announced, as you can see, that a hosiery was changing its name and was now Aryan owned, while this advertisement emphasized the historic nature of the business, which had been in operation for 75 years, but was now purely Aryan. Overall, more than 400 laws and decrees were passed both by the government, the national government, and by local authorities between 1933 and 1939, limiting the rights and opportunities available to Jews. And the goal was simple: get the Jews to leave. And really, they did. In January of 1933, when Hitler came to power, there were 523,000 Jews living in Germany, representing less than 1% of the total population. Somewhere between 37 and 38,000 Jews left Germany in the year following Hitler's rise to power. And by 1937, 90,000 more had gotten out of Germany. By 1937, however, German authorities were no longer just satisfied with getting Jews to leave. They also wanted to make sure the Jews left with none of their assets. They had imposed laws that created fines or penalties for Jews who took their money with them, ostensibly making it impossible for Jews to take any of their accumulated wealth, even of the smallest amount, out of Germany. And as you will know, if you've listened to some of our virtual tours, 1938, the following year, was a real year of turning points. The first turning point came in March of that year when the joining of Germany and Austria, the so-called Anschluss, essentially overnight, the 192,000 Jews in Austria were forced to face the full range of anti-Semitic laws that had taken 5 years to take effect in Germany. By August of 1938, just a few months later, Adolf Eichmann had established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration in Vienna, which used a combination of intimidation and economic exclusion to force Austrian Jews to leave the country. Franz Mayer, one of the leaders of the Berlin Zionist Federation, later described the operation that Eichmann oversaw from his offices in Vienna, saying, "You put in a Jew at one end with property, a shop, a bank account, and legal rights. He passed through the building and came out at the other end without property, without privileges, without rights, with nothing except a passport and order to leave the country within a fortnight. Otherwise, he would find himself inside a concentration camp." So that was the process to push the Jews out. In 6 months, Eichmann expelled nearly 45,000 Jews from Austria. One of the problems, however, was that while Germany could successfully get Jews to agree to leave, other countries were not so willing to allow the Jews to come in. Even America, with its Statue of Liberty and the Emma Lazarus poem, "You're tired, you're poor," America had imposed strict limits to immigration. Throughout the 19th century, from its founding in 1776 up through the 19th century, America had an open door to immigrants. Anybody could come in. But there was a rising tide of nativism in America that emerged in the 1880s and then in the 1890s and flowered in the 1920s. And I don't want to go into the full details of the American immigration system, but as you may know, in the 1920s, the US imposed sharp restrictions on the number of immigrants who could enter the country, setting an annual quota for each country based on the number of Americans who trace their heritage back to that country, the National Origins Act. Here's the famous political cartoon that captures an image of how the quota system worked. For Germans, after the 1938 annexation of Austria, the US set an annual quota of 27,370 immigrants. That was then broken down to monthly quotas of 2,280 people per month. If more than 2,280 Germans applied to enter America in any month, they were put on a waiting list for the following month, which often turned into months and months or years. And since the shipping lines that brought immigrants to the United States were responsible for paying their return passage for anyone who was not allowed into the country, the shipping lines began quickly to refuse to sell tickets to anybody unless they had a valid quota number. The result of the system was that thousands of Germans eager to get out of Nazi Germany were forced to wait for their number to be called. You can see in this graphic the situation in 1938. Overall, in 1938, the United States issued 19,522 visas out of the total of 27,370 quota spots. Even though there were spots that went unfilled, the waiting list of people who did not have all their paperwork in or who didn't fit into the monthly quota to which they were allotted grew to almost 140,000 people. It was in this situation, with more than 100,000 refugees clamoring to get into America and finding the doors closed, that Democratic political leaders in America called for reforms to the quota laws. FDR, the president, however, knew that immigration was a hot-button issue that would give his opponents and the opponents of the Democrats who are running in the upcoming midterm election ammunition against them. The quota laws had been passed in the 1920s because of a fear of immigrants, and that fear in 1938 still ran strong. Americans were far more concerned with the Depression and economic possibilities or opportunities in the United States than on immigration issues. So instead of taking a leadership role in reforming immigration, FDR diverted attention and called for an international conference to address the refugee problem, the Evian Conference. 32 countries sent representatives to the meeting. You'll notice, however, that the countries that showed up were heavily weighted to those in Central and South America. There were 10 European countries who sent delegates, but 19 Central and South American countries. No Asian or African countries were included, although several European countries included colonial holdings still in both of those continents, most notably the United Kingdom. While most delegations included ambassadors or government ministers, Roosevelt chose not to send a high-level official, like the Secretary of State, but instead he asked Myron C. Taylor, a businessman and close friend of FDR's, to represent the United States. Just as a sense of how strange this was or how different it was, France, you see the French delegate in here, sent the French ambassador to the United States, a senior figure, Henry Beringer. He went to represent France. And England sent a member of Parliament who was also in Neville Chamberlain's cabinet, Lord Winterton. So major figures, but America sent a private businessman who was just delegated by President Roosevelt to operate on America's behalf. Most descriptions of the conference highlight that during the 9-day meeting, delegate after delegate rose, expressed sympathy for the Jewish refugees, but then claimed they could do nothing because allowing more refugees into their countries would cause economic hardship at a time when things were difficult enough during the Depression. And that certainly was the case. That is what happened during the meeting. The American delegate, Myron Taylor, to some degree set the tone, saying in America that it would take a congressional act to increase the American refugees allowed in and the quota, and thus it was beyond his power to commit to taking more refugees. The British delegation claimed that Britain was already fully populated and was suffering from unemployment, so it couldn't take any larger number of refugees, although they did admit that British territories in East Africa would take in a small number of additional refugees. In the end, regardless of the statements the British made at Evian, the UK allowed more than 60,000 German refugees to resettle in its borders over the next 2 years in 1939 and 1940. The French delegation at the Evian Conference declared that France had reached the extreme point of saturation as regards admission of refugees, although in the following year, it too did keep the door open a little to allow further refugees in. Most countries, like Canada, refused to make any commitment. And floating throughout the various conversations at the conference was a combination of anti-Semitism and racism. The Australian delegate admitted as much when he said, "As we have no racial problem, we are not desirous of importing one," saying pretty much that letting Jews in would create a racial problem. The Canadian Prime Minister harbored similar racist sentiments, but kept them in his personal diary, writing, "We must seek to keep this part of the continent free from unrest and from too great an intermixture of foreign strains of blood." Again, seeing the racist sentiments there. The only country willing to accept a larger number of Jews was the Dominican Republic, which offered to accept up to 100,000 refugees. We might think that the offer from the Dominican Republic was a sign of a particular concern with the plight of Jews in Europe, but that was really not the case. The dictator Rafael Trujillo, who ruled in the Dominican Republic, appears to have accepted Jewish refugees, or to have made this offer to accept Jewish refugees, in the hope that Western leaders would overlook the fact that he'd ordered a massacre of 25,000 Haitians just the previous year. He also saw the European Jews as a group that would help to whiten the population of the Dominican Republic over time. If 100,000 European Jews came, then intermarried with the residents in the Dominican Republic, his vision was that this would lead to a whiter nation and that was better for some reason. For Jews seeking refuge from Nazi Germany, perhaps the reasoning why the Dominican Republic offered the additional 100,000 spots was really of little importance. However, more important perhaps to those Jews was the small size of the Dominican Republic, its distance from Germany, and the lack of consistent steamship routes between Europe and the DR. All of that meant that it was not easy, despite the offer by the Dominican Republic to take more Jews, it was not easy to get there. And in the end, less than 1,000 Jewish refugees made it from Germany to the Dominican Republic. So even though one country at the conference offered to take more refugees, in the end, it was unable to really fulfill in a major way that offer that it made. I think that's the common narrative of the Evian Conference. This political cartoon came out before the conference, showing German Jews blocked at all exits, and it proved pretty accurate, this cartoon, with the conference not providing any new routes out of Germany in any kind of legitimate way. However, even before the meeting opened, the American delegate Myron Taylor told delegates from England and other countries that the only realistic goal for the conference was not individual commitments from separate countries, which he knew America was not going to do, but instead to establish the groundwork for an intergovernmental body that would continue to work on a solution to the refugee crisis. And that goal was met, as by the end of the conference, the countries present had established the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, the IGCR. In the end, however, the ICR was little more than a PR achievement for the Evian Conference that had neither the funding nor the authority to make real differences over the following years. And in 1947, after the war, its activities were taken over by the UN's International Refugee Organization. In hindsight, I think we can see the failure of the Evian Conference. 2 months after Evian, in September of 1938, Britain and France granted Hitler the right to occupy the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. And 2 months after that, the Nazis launched a national attack on Jews that we now call Kristallnacht. And little over a year after the meeting in France, Germany launched its invasion of Poland and began the Second World War. Despite the failure of the Evian Conference, there was a significant increase in Jewish emigration from Nazi Germany between 1938 and 1940, so that more than 60% of German and Austrian Jews were able to get out of Germany. However, tens of thousands of Jews who tried to flee from Germany were unable to find a refuge before the Nazi regime began the implementation of the final solution, which eventually led to the death of more than 230,000 German and Austrian Jews. In addition, 100,000 Jewish refugees who'd fled from Germany and Austria to other European nations, they were later trapped when those countries were overrun by the Nazis, and a significant portion of that 100,000 were murdered in the Holocaust. The lesson from Evian, I think, is easy to see, but it's difficult to implement. We know that if the world wants to prevent future genocides, countries must open their doors to refugees despite their own national interests or public opinion. That, however, was not easy to do in 1938 and remains a challenge today. Still, we have this picture in our gallery to highlight this moment when the world failed to act as a lesson for us to think about today. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you for watching. I hope that you learned something about the Evian Conference. Of course, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A window and I'll get to them. Let me take a moment to remind you of some of our other upcoming programs. This coming Sunday, July 11th, we hope you'll come at 9 a.m. to the lawn behind our building and join us for morning yoga, relieve some stress, enjoy the beauty of the Welwyn Preserve, and so come and join us. Later in the evening on Sunday, July 11th at 6 p.m., join us for the next program in our Sunday with Survivor series, this time with Rosette Privert-Gerbosi, who will share information about her pre-war life in France, her experience of being sent into hiding by her parents, and her life after the war. And one more to mention, I'll be back for my next Curated Corner next Wednesday, July 14th, again at 11 a.m., to draw attention to the actions of German officials and French police, who rounded up more than 13,000 Jews in France on July 16th and 17th in 1942, detaining them in an indoor cycling track in Paris, the Vélodrome d'Hiver. As always, you can find more information about these programs and a full schedule of our upcoming activities on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click on the Events tab. And I will also ask that if you could go to our website and click the Give Now button, it would be greatly appreciated and help support our online programming. Okay, let me look at your questions. I see a few have come in. Oops, let me pop that down here. Okay. Did no one at the conference attempt to ask the Australian delegate about the original population in Australia? No racial problem. Yeah, that's absolutely true, Felice. To claim there were no racial problems in Australia in 1938 was to be blind to reality, for sure. But no, I don't believe Aboriginal issues came up in any way, and nobody was talking about them. What were some of the other pressures on FDR that led him to send such a low-level envoy? Yeah, you know, I think he did not think it was a winning political move to send somebody of high power who would then be forced to make either decisions that were going to be problematic later on for FDR and for the Democrats, or more likely just be interrogated about the failure of America to do more. So by sending somebody who was a kind of non-entity, a low-level person, then there was low expectation about what that delegate could actually do. And I think that's the reason why he sent this friend and this delegate rather than the Secretary of State or some ambassador. He wanted the expectations to be clear to anybody who saw it, because he just saw this as a losing issue politically. And FDR was not going to be able to get Congress to pass immigration reform, and he did not feel like he could act unilaterally. Despite the failures at Evian, were any other conferences contemplated to address the issue of Jewish refugees? You know, I think that, I don't know for sure, but my sense is that Evian made clear that there was no capacity in the world or interest in the world to help the Jewish refugees in a kind of global scale. There was this new international body that was created, but they did little except meet. I don't even think they did much more than meet a couple of times over the following years. They had no ability to do anything. And once the war started in 1939, the opportunity for Jews to get out of Europe was highly curtailed because there was military action going on in Germany. And then once Pearl Harbor happened, there's military action going on around the world. So the war really also curtailed the possibility of providing any assistance. To what degree was the Jewish community united in pressuring FDR? There was a great deal of pressure, although there was divisions in the Jewish community in America about how to respond and whether attention should be to encourage Jews to go to Palestine, then under British rule, or to encourage them to come into the United States. So there was not a singular voice coming from all the Jews in the United States, perhaps not surprisingly. But there was a lot of pressure put on FDR, but again, he saw this as just not a winning issue, that the larger issues of the Depression in 1938 were more important to his reelection and to the election of Democrats. And so the immigration story was not one that was going to sell easily, he thought. Did the German-American Bund apply any pressure at that time to influence politicians in the United States? You know, that's a good question. I don't think that the Bund was exerting pressure on politicians. They were trying to rally support for America to stay neutral after the war started. And, but, you know, honestly, that's something I need to look into. So it's a good question about what force and what pressure was being applied by the Bund. But in honesty, the Germans did send a delegation. They weren't an official delegation, but they had some representatives at the Evian Conference, and their interest was to have Jews get out. There was some reference to one of their members in the delegation had been told that they would get 45,000 Jews out of Germany in the next year. So I don't think the Bund was opposed to Jews coming out of Germany. I think they probably would have been opposed to Jews coming into America. But as I said, Germany, although not officially a delegate, was not opposed to finding ways for Jews to get out of Germany and enter other countries. That was okay by them. Yeah, and one more question here. To what degree was Palestine a viable option for Jewish refugees? Palestine ended up providing a home, I can't remember the number, not as many as came to America in the period before 1940 went to Palestine. But the British really locked it down and said, and this happened at Evian, where they said, we're not going to open the doors in Palestine to sending more Jews and refugees from Germany. So Palestine, while apparently and kind of on its cover as an appealing option, in reality did not prove to be a destination that was welcoming because of British rule in Palestine. It seems that, Sherry writes, it seems that the conference gave Hitler carte blanche to go ahead with his final solution. I think it's true. Not necessarily the final solution, but because he wasn't thinking that in 1938. The Nazis had not come up with the plan of the final solution in 1939 and 38. They were not planning for mass murder at the time. There were no gas chambers and such in 1938. But I think what Hitler saw clearly was that there was no world support, global support for Jews either. And so he took it as a green light that he could certainly increase persecution or continue the persecution of Jews, and there was nothing that anybody was going to do about it. And as we saw, there was also little that in terms of a world appetite for how to respond to German territorial expansion either. So that the Munich Accords came later on, the allowing of Germany to expand into what had been Czechoslovakia. The world powers were largely willing to look the other way rather than fear or have that fear that war would start again. And so essentially gave Hitler free hand in everything that he did, including the persecution of Jews. One more question. Few people in the US know about FDR's reluctance to accept Jews, not only with Evian, but also other incidents, like turning away of the SS St. Louis. It doesn't seem to have affected his favorable legacy. Was there and is there an effort to hide this anti-Semitic legacy? I don't think it's something that's being hidden, and there have been a number of books that have come out in the last decade that highlight this. And I think there's no question that FDR had a strain of anti-Semitism, although I think he was also and we know this, was a smart politician. And he saw what was going to help him and edge towards war, and then thought that winning the war was the more important thing rather than ending the murders that were taking place at killing centers. So I'm not sure it's all attributable just to anti-Semitism. There was political forces at bay or at will here going on. And the fact is that nobody else in America was pushing on his side to say, you've got to go and stop this, except for a very small minority, obviously the JDC, the Jewish community in the United States, and the International Refugee Board later on. But we're not talking about loud voices, and he had other pressures on him, and so he didn't act. If the British let Jews into the UK, why didn't they allow Jews into Palestine? Yeah, that's a good question, Felice. I think there was awareness in England that there were tensions in Palestine, and if they were going to let Jews in 1938, there was a fear that things were going to get out of control. And we know they eventually did get out of control, the British, and the British ended up giving the land up in 1946 and letting the UN come in, or 47. But I think that's the reason why. And the policy in 1938 by the British was they weren't going to take more. It's just as the following year proceeded, Jews would come across the channel, would find ways in, and they would partly because of proximity, let those Jews come in. But to go to Palestine was seen as something that was going to cause more trouble for the British later on. Okay, well, thanks very much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you at some of our other programs soon. Be well. Take care.